privilege and honor it is to stand in front of all of you who similarly carry stories filled with resiliency, trauma, hope. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I want to start by saying that I take this opportunity very seriously. It's a responsibility and a heavier weight than you may realize to try and get it just right. To be a voice for the voiceless, to honor memories of those no longer with us, to move us all collectively by a fire to do better for our sisters and brothers around the world and the children in our classrooms who depend on us to make it right. We are in a difficult moment in our recent history. It's a delicate balance to strike between understanding and accountability, compassion, and justice. I acknowledge the privilege I and all of us here carry. In the safety and the coolness of this conference hall, my intention is to hold space and also hold the trauma, whether directly or vicariously experienced by all of us doing the vital work that we do. I ask for your grace as we traverse difficult topics. I was also told we have some friends from the media. Yes, I'm looking at you, speaking to you directly, and I ask that you listen with open hearts. With that, I also wanted to state up front a trigger warning as I discuss topics that involve violence and death, which may impact this particular crowd more than most, and so I empower you to do what you need to take care of yourself if need be, including stepping outside. It won't offend me. A little more about me. I heard the little cheers, so I was born and raised in North Carolina. I went to UNC Chapel Hill. I see y'all. Both undergrad and med schools. Okay, my parents are Syrian. We used to spend fun-filled summers in Syria growing up. Idlib in particular, which is a small town close to Aleppo in northwestern Syria, about 30 minutes from the Turkish border. In 2010, the conflict in Syria broke amidst the Arab Spring spreading across the Middle East. As the months turned into years, family in Idlib became internally displaced. Then violence would get bad enough they would cross the Turkish border, but then cost of living would be too high, so they'd come back into Idlib. The violence would escalate again, they'd flee again, until the violence became intolerable. Think chemical warfare, airstrikes, gunfires in the streets. Many were leaving for good. In 2015, there was a mass exodus of Syrians fleeing on foot. Today, Syria remains the world's largest refugee crisis, with over 6 million forced to flee their country and another 6 million Syrians internally displaced. There was news coverage of the unprecedented amount of people crossing the Aegean Sea from Turkey to the Greek island of Lesbos, with rafts capsizing being the expectation. I was following the family WhatsApp group, tracking some cousins as they journeyed on foot from Syria to Germany, with one cousin on those rafts with kerosene leaking down and burning her leg, but no ability to move from how overcrowded it was. Or another uncle who texted us that the raft he was supposed to be on ended up capsizing, and his family miraculously made it okay on the next one. Creating what is now known as the Life Vest Graveyard in Lesbos, with over 500,000 deserted life vests. We had recently lost my cousin, Suzanne Barakat, who was shot on his balcony in Idlib, Syria, by regime soldiers on this very street as he was yelling at the soldiers to let go of his baby brother. The same balcony I had spent summer evenings taking in the lovely breeze, listening to some old school Arabic music, sipping on late night tea. So it wasn't totally shocking when I was at San Francisco General Hospital in a busy pediatric urgent care shift, wrapping up an incision and drainage of an abscess, when my phone starts blowing up with condolences. Surely it was someone in Syria. I actually ignored my phone at first, but then calls start coming in. This is my baby brother, Dia, a second-year dental student at UNC Chapel Hill, top of his class, adored by all, and his wife of 6 weeks, Yusuf, who was just accepted to join him at UNC Dental. They were fundraising to organize a dental relief trip for Syrian refugees in Turkey. And this is Suzanne, Yusuf's sister, an architectural engineering student who was visiting for dinner. Zia, Yusuf, and Razan were murdered, execution style, in the safety of their Chapel Hill home by their white supremacist neighbor because they were Muslim, by a man who had a plethora of anti-religious posts on his social media, who told them he didn't like the way they looked. I took a red eye, and by the time I landed in North Carolina, the police had issued a statement based on the murderer's claim that it was due to a parking dispute. The Muslim community was outraged. Still in scrubs, I gave a press statement asking for this to be investigated federally as a hate crime. Within 24 hours of the murders, I was on CNN's Anderson Cooper, and the families were on a flurry of national media interviews trying to set the record straight. As media outlet after outlet repeated the soundbite, "Tell us about this parking dispute." The police took the words of the murderer, who turned himself in, while chuckling shared how he executed them, and then was applauded by law enforcement. I'll spare you the former, but see for yourself the latter, a clip from the newly released documentary called 36 Seconds.
To be given some type of benefit of the doubt, some type of control of the narrative after these horrific murders.
I will be honest with you, I respect you taking this on the chin like a man. And man, I respect that. I mean, do you think something, just the rage caused you to snap? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
He's jovial and ingratiating to the police officers, and it's clear that he considers himself closer, more like these police officers in this position, that they would understand why he did what he did.
You got a long road ahead of you, man. I wish you luck.
The road that I made for myself, sir. I appreciate it.
What Mr. Hicks told the police, we know is not accurate. He lied to the police about Dia that day, saying that Dia had cursed him.
Fuck you, you worth a piece of shit.
He even speculated that Dia had a knife and had cut him.
He started making a movement towards me, so I pulled real quick and started shooting. He came out and hit me with a knife or something. I don't know. But something cut my thumb. I don't know what else would have cut my thumb because it was bleeding over the place. This is all my blood. I'm bleeding.
But it was a lie. Which we know because Dia found a way to tell the truth, even after his life was taken. This is always so hard.
In an attempt to capture his threats, Dia had filmed the encounter in his chest pocket. How we confirmed there was no parking dispute, no altercation. It was deliberate and targeted. He came to their door as they were eating dinner. Dia opens the door, and the murderer proceeds to shoot. 36 seconds of terror, girls screaming, pleading for their lives, and then silence. Imagine, as a physician, reading autopsy reports of your young, healthy family members. Cause of death, laceration of midbrain by bullet, because the girls were put on their knees and executed. Imagine looking into your brother's casket and seeing a circular gap in his teeth, and learning then that the 8th and final fatal bullet was to his mouth. Some of the rage that I felt at that time was that if roles were reversed and an Arab, Muslim, or Muslim-appearing person had killed 3 white American college students execution style in their home, what would we have called it? A terrorist attack. When white men commit acts of violence in this country, they are lone wolves, mentally ill, or driven by a parking dispute. Words matter. Call it what it is, a terrorist attack, an ideologically motivated act of violence committed by a white supremacist who hated Muslims. it leads to murder. How do we do this to one another? The pyramid of hate, adopted by the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, provides a good framework to understanding human rights violations in their differing contexts. At the base, you'll see here we all carry implicit biases. That's fear of differences, which can lead to acts of bias like microaggression, cultural appropriation, which can lead to systemic discrimination, think criminal justice disparities, immigration and border policies, double standard media representation, which can lead to bias-motivated acts of violence like rape, murder, terrorism, and can ultimately lead to genocide or killing of entire groups of people. In other words, when we otherize people, we dehumanize them, which then allows us to justify something like violence or murder, or even an eradication of an entire population. Our families founded the Our Three Winners Foundation with a mission to promote equity and reduce prejudice against Muslims and marginalized communities through grant-making, advocacy, service, and evidence-based programming, with a vision that never again will Islamophobia prove fatal. Let's take a step back and zoom out. A little Islam 101, because I don't want to assume everyone knows, and if you do, great, a little review. Islam is an Abrahamic monotheistic faith shared with Judaism and Christianity. Muslims believe Prophet Muhammad is the last messenger, with equal reverence given to Prophets Moses and Jesus. It is the second largest religion in the world, and it's also the fastest growing. There are 1.9 billion Muslims worldwide. In the US, we have 3.5 million, making up 1.1% of the US population. According to a 2023 Gallup poll, the religious makeup of the United States is 2/3 Christian, 22% religiously unaffiliated, and 7% other religions. Within the 7%, 2% of the US is Jewish, 1% is Muslim, 1% is Buddhist. I didn't like that they had among others, but I apologize, it's a good thing this happened. The Muslim American community is not a monolith. Muslims are the most ethnically diverse faith community in America. It is the only community without a majority race. Contrary to popular belief, Arab American Muslims only make up 14% of the Muslim American community, 28% are Black. American Muslims look like what all of America will look like in the future, no majority race. So what is Islamophobia? Islamophobia is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. It is experienced by Muslims regardless of their religiosity, ethnicity, or culture, and by non-Muslims who are perceived as Muslims. Well, what about the term anti-Muslim hate? It does not incorporate the broader array of structural, racial inequalities that Muslims face. Consider, for example, a Muslim facing discrimination at the workplace based on having the name Muhammad. This is not an example of hatred necessarily, yet is clearly a type of racism and is Islamophobic. The Carter Center put out this report and says, Islamophobia is not just an arbitrary fear of Muslims. It is in large part the function of an anti-Muslim industry and well-funded and well-connected network of individuals, institutions, and donors. The Islamophobia industry is comprised of political, ideological, institutional, and economic networks. More specifically, media outlets, political figures, far-right white nationalist groups, Islamophobia influencers, pro-Israel fringe right groups, Muslim dissidents, think tanks, security experts, and the donors who fund their campaigns. This figure was pulled from a report on the Canadian Islamophobia industry. A 2019 report by CARE, titled Hijacked by Hate, mapped the flow of funding from charitable organizations to anti-Muslim interest groups. They examined publicly available tax filings of anti-Muslim organizations and found that 1,096 organizations were responsible for funding 39 groups involved in the Islamophobia network between 2014 and 2016. The total revenue capacity of the Islamophobia network during this 2 period alone amounted to at least $1.5 billion. My brother was murdered in 2015. I was invited to give a TED Talk that highlighted the rise and fatal nature of Islamophobia. It was released on the eve of the election when Trump was elected first time around. I attended a roundtable with then President Obama and frankly hit my lowest point of depression. I made my story heard to the most powerful leader in the world, and nothing actually changed. Hate crimes continued to rise. The Muslim ban happened shortly after. My Syrian grandmother, who became a refugee in her 80s, was denied entry to the US to join her only child due to the Muslim ban, and ended up dying and being buried in foreign soil, stripped of her property, her dignity, and her family. These days it's felt like a very long, many days. It feels like Islamophobia is a socially acceptable form of bigotry. We have politicians reaping political and financial gains off our backs. Did you know that hate crimes rise in parallel with presidential elections? And not just Trump's. During the South Carolina primary in 2016, Donald Trump made admiring comments about executing Islamic terrorists with, quote, bullets coated in pig blood. I challenged him to meet me and tell me to my face that Dia, Yusuf, and Roseanne were deserving of the bullets. Okay, so let's see what the data shows us. You're all educators, academicians, data matters. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, or ISPU, surveyed Americans and asked if they faced religious discrimination over the past year. In 2022, American Muslims were the most likely group to report facing religious discrimination at 62%. As found in previous years, Jewish Americans were the next most likely group to report experiencing religious discrimination at 52%. More than half of Muslims and Jews faced religious discrimination in any given year. Here's where it gets interesting. Among those who reported facing any religious discrimination in the past year, they asked about whether it occurred in various settings. They found that Muslims stand apart from all others in terms of not only the frequency, but how they experience religious discrimination. Particularly, Muslims who have experienced religious discrimination in the past year are more likely than Jews and the general public who have faced religious discrimination to experience it in their interactions within institutional settings. Muslims are more likely than Jewish Americans and the general public to experience discrimination when applying for a job and when interacting with law enforcement. Other institutional settings where Muslims are much more likely than Jewish Americans and the general public to face religious discrimination include when seeking health care and at the airport. Are you familiar with the term flying while Muslim? For years, traveling through SFO, including after getting vetted to go meet with POTUS, I was randomly selected for additional screening 99% of the time. I don't know about you, but I took statistics in high school and random means 1 and 2 or 50%. I was repeatedly pat down, my bun under my hijab squeezed despite going through the visual scanner because somehow I could miraculously hide something in there. Crotch violated and swabbed for bomb residue. Think of that humiliation every single time I flew. And perhaps then you can understand my anger, how I am perceived as the threat when it is this very rhetoric that killed my family. Do you remember the Islamophobia network we just discussed? This is structural racism that entails anti-Muslim hate. In 2022, I attended the United We Stand Summit at the White House, where President Biden awarded me with the Uniter Award. Things had been feeling pretty bleak, but I have to admit that summit rejuvenated something in me. I looked around the room, and there were activists and civil rights warriors representing every major hate crime our country has seen in the last couple decades. Sikh, Black, Indigenous, LGBTQ, Asian, Jewish, Arab, Muslim. It was the beautiful, diverse melting pot I know our country to be. I scanned the room, and I saw so much trauma, but also resiliency, our shared humanity, and a deep understanding of the impact of hate on all of us. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I had a moment of hope. We've talked about how language matters. Here I was, sitting closest to PoCC's podium. They were calling anti-Muslim attacks terrorist attacks, highlighting the rise of anti-Muslim terrorist attacks on people and property in the White House by a white man. That may not seem huge to some of you, but when you are fighting to correct the narrative from parking dispute to hate crime, shifting that narrative is everything. With an acknowledgement of what we've known all along, but is not represented in our media reporting. 90% of hate crime perpetrators are motivated by biases consistent with white supremacy or male supremacy, or both. ISPU data shows that perceived Muslims accused of a plot receive an average 770% more media than others accused of plots of similar magnitude. I'm just curious, just a show of hands, who here actually heard about the Chapel Hill shooting back in 2015? Look around the room. Some, but not enough. Do you agree? One of the outcomes of the United We Stand Summit was outlined expectations for federal agencies to respond to the President's call to prevent, respond to, and recover from hate-fueled violence, and to foster national unity. This Free to Learn initiative was launched by the U.S. Department of Education. It's an ed-funded technical assistance center. NCSSLE hosts resources specifically to support Jewish and Muslim students, MENA students, and others, as well as a series of webinars. Their audience is specifically pre-K to 12 educators, so this is a great resource for you all. Okay, let's dive deeper into religious-based bullying. As in previous years, Muslim families are by far the most likely to have a child who has been bullied for their religion. With 48% of Muslim families reporting having a child who faced religious-based bullying in the past year. In comparison, 13% of Jewish families and 18% of families in the general public reported having a child who was bullied for their religion. Even more alarming is that 20% of Muslim families report that the bullying happens nearly every day. Said differently, Muslim children are 2 times as likely as the general public to be bullied for their faith. With a big caveat that this data is from 2022 and does not reflect the last year. Then they asked, among those who reported a child has faced religious-based bullying, who bullied the child? This was again 2022, during the pandemic, so it included online settings as well. 64% reported bullying occurred at school from other students. And get this, 4 in 10 Muslim families who've experienced bullying say the bully was a teacher or school official at school. And roughly 1 in 5 say the bully was a teacher or school official online. If there's no other takeaway from this talk, I want you to look at these numbers again. 42% say the bully was a teacher at school, 19% say the bully was a teacher online. Believe your kids. In sum, Muslim children and parents have to worry about facing religious-based bullying at school and online from other students and even trusted adults in the school. I have worked on and contributed to the first ever White House U.S. national strategy to counter Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism. It is in the works to be released soon with more recommendations as it pertains to education, so look out for its release. And then October 7th happened. As the JVP describes it, following 16 years of Israeli military blockade, Hamas fighters launched an unprecedented assault in which hundreds of Israelis were killed and wounded and civilians kidnapped. The Israeli government declared war, launching airstrikes, killing hundreds of Palestinians and wounding thousands, bombing residential buildings, and threatening to commit war crimes against besieged Palestinians in Gaza. A dark time in our world became suddenly darker. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't function, I cried often and deeply at every mother's pain over losing a child, whether Israeli or Palestinian, at the frivolity in which we were treating the sanctity of all life. And what has followed over the past year is the unfolding of a genocide right before our eyes. I was glued to the news, feeling guilty that I couldn't get myself to look at all the images, as it triggers my PTSD and takes me down a dark path. I was watching the way American media was covering what was unfolding. I had a knot in my stomach, and I just knew it was only a matter of time. A week later, Wadir al-Fayoumi, a 6-year-old Palestinian-American boy, was killed when he was stabbed 26 times in his home in a Chicago suburb by his landlord. He initially stabbed his mother, telling her, "You Muslims must die." On October 27th, I was one of 5 Muslim Americans who met with President Biden to discuss Gaza and the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian rhetoric and violence domestically. I connected with him in our shared loss of loved ones. I told him his superpower is empathy, and that's what makes him relatable as everyday Joe. And I told him, you are lacking empathy for Palestinian suffering. We pleaded for a ceasefire, to stop sending billions of dollars of our federal funds towards weaponry that is killing predominantly children and women in an open-air prison, that is targeting schools and hospitals and buildings of worship with no access to food, aid, or shelter. At the end, he apologized and promised more empathy for Palestinian suffering. He leaned in and placed his hand on mine, saying he's not just a president, he's a father and a grandfather. And I leaned in and said, but in this moment, you are the president, and you can stop this. It was a heavy, seemingly sincere and moving moment. A request for a humanitarian pause was called for shortly after, but a genocide continued to unfold over the next year. A genocide that has never been better documented in the history of the world. The UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. The acts include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group and or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. As a physician who also documents forensic evidence of torture and ill treatment, according to UN protocol and guidelines, what is happening in Gaza has the textbook hallmarks of a genocide. But don't ask me. The United Nations, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, and multitude of human rights organizations share these concerns. Our government and country has provided bipartisan support of the state of Israel. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump couldn't agree on almost anything, except for their unwavering support for the country of Israel. So then, what's the issue? Why is it so hard to talk about? Let's take a couple minutes to frame additional terminology relevant to this context, so we can't understand it before we can actually define it. We're going to talk about anti-Palestinian racism, Zionism, and anti-Semitism. Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. An important note, scholars and activists have rightly pointed out the problematic nature of conflating anti-Palestinian racism with Islamophobia. First, it ignores the fact that Palestinians are not all Muslim, and erases the identity of Christian Palestinians. Second, the conflation reduces a settler colonial conflict to a matter of mere religious belief. The Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism breaks down the various forms it takes. Examples are denying the Nakba, justifying violence against Palestinians, failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people with a collective identity, belonging, and rights in relation to occupied and historic Palestine, erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians, excluding or pressuring others to exclude Palestinian perspectives, Palestinians, and their non-Palestinian allies, defaming Palestinians and their non-Palestinian allies with slander, such as being inherently anti-Semitic, a terrorist, threat, or sympathizer, or simply opposed to democratic values. The Institute for Middle Eastern Understanding says the Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic, refers to the violent expulsion of approximately 3/4 of all Palestinians from their homes and homeland by Zionist militias and the new Israeli army during the State of Israel's establishment in 1947 to 1949. 1948 marked the end of the British Mandate and the beginning of Israel as an independent Jewish state. Palestinian Muslim and Christian Arabs considered the day considered a Nakba whereby they were dispossessed from their home, lands, and livelihoods as a result of Israeli ethnic cleansing operations during the Arab-Israeli War between 47 and 49. By understanding the history of the Nakba, you can uncover its profound intersections with Black and Indigenous liberation movements. The IMU states, the roots of the Nakba and the ongoing problems in Palestine-Israel today lie in the emergence of political Zionism in the late 1800s, when some European Jews, influenced by the nationalism then sweeping the continent, decided that the solution to anti-Semitism in Europe and Russia was the establishment of a state for Jews in Palestine. They began emigrating to Palestine as colonists, where they started dispossessing indigenous Muslim and Christian Palestinians. I apologize for getting a little text heavy, but as we've established, language matters, and I'm quoting you words from the experts themselves, so I appreciate your patience here. I promise it won't all be like this. Okay, so what is Zionism? According to the ADL, Zionism is the movement for the self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. The vast majority of Jews around the world feel a connection or kinship with Israel, whether or not they explicitly identify as Zionists, and regardless of their opinions on the policies of the Israeli government. The Jewish Voice for Peace adds, it's important to note that people who consider themselves Zionists have different interpretations of what that label means in the present political moment, to them personally and historically. Moreover, over time, multiple strains of Zionism have emerged, including political Zionism, religious Zionism, and cultural Zionism. The political ideology of Zionism, regardless of which strain, has resulted in the establishment of a Jewish nation-state in the land of historic Palestine. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled as part of that process, their homes and property confiscated. Despite recognition of their rights by the United Nations, their rights to return and be compensated have long been denied by the US and Israel. In '67, Israel occupied what is now known as the Occupied Palestinian Territories, putting millions of people under military rule. Long-standing systemic inequalities privileged Jews over Palestinians inside Israel and the occupied territories. If you haven't already read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, The Message, it offers a profound analysis critiquing the establishment of a state founded on ethnocentric superiority as an inherently systemically racist framework. Okay. What is anti-Semitism? It is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. This is what is known as the working definition of anti-Semitism, a draft initially published in 2005 as part of an effort by the European Monitoring Center of Racism and Xenophobia, aimed to provide a practical tool for identifying, addressing anti-Semitism, particularly in the context of data collection and hate crime reporting. It was adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, in 2016. Accompanying the working definition, but of disputed status, are 11 illustrative examples whose purpose is described as guiding the IRA in its work, 7 of which relate to criticism of Israel. One of the examples states that anti-Semitism is embodied in, quote, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. It also says that it's anti-Semitic, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Kenneth Stern, an American attorney and scholar specializing in anti-Semitism, was the lead author of what became known as the working definition of anti-Semitism. In the New Yorker, he says, "It was not drafted and was never intended as a tool to target or chill speech on a college campus." And in The Guardian, "I drafted the definition of anti-Semitism. Right-wing Jews are weaponizing it. The working definition of anti-Semitism was never intended to silence speech, but that's what Trump's executive order accomplished in 2019. In the recently released White House U.S. National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism, it says, "There are several definitions of anti-Semitism which serve as a valuable tool to raise awareness and increase understanding of anti-Semitism. The most prominent is the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism, adopted in 2016 by the 31 member states of the IRA, which the U.S. has embraced. In addition, the administration welcomes and appreciates the Nexus document and notes other such efforts." Now, what is the Nexus Project? They describe themselves as advocating for the full implementation of the National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism, including its framework for understanding anti-Semitism. "We raise awareness and education against the misuse of accusations of anti-Semitism as political weapons and the conflation of Jew hatred with legitimate criticism of Israeli policy, which undermines the fight against the increasing threat of anti-Semitism." The IRA definition has been adopted by 43 governments. the U.S. is entering uncharted territory now by attempting to introduce this non-legally binding working definition into federal law. The JVP comments, criticism of Zionism is not to be conflated with anti-Semitism. States such as Israel and the United States are openly criticized in public life, and their political beliefs and policies are subject to critical debate in accord with our basic First Amendment rights. Professor Neve Gordon, an Israeli professor of international law and human rights, is quoted saying, "The idea that comparing policies carried out by Israel with policies carried out by the Nazi regime is anti-Semitic is crazy. What the definition tries to do is silence legitimate critique of Israel and the genocide it is carrying out in Gaza." We don't have federal data on hate crimes in 2023, but polling and surveys has suggested that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian racism are on the rise. The Council of American Islamic Relations, the nation's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization, received a staggering 2171 complaints of anti-Palestinian racism in just 2 months between October and December, and over 170% increase in reports compared to the same time the year before. It is important to note, though, in general, it is estimated that only 1% of hate crimes actually get reported. And did you know, for example, in the case of Dia, Yusur, and Razan, while the court of public opinion has labeled the Chapel Hill shooting a hate crime, it does not have the legal definition of one. And if that can't get labeled as a hate crime, can you imagine how many we actually miss? Study reveals widespread anti-Palestinian racism in schools and other academic institutions. It finds that more than 70% of university students and educators face considerable discrimination, emotional and physical health effects for supporting Palestinian human rights. In places of learning, there has been silencing, erasure, censorship, intimidation, and even terminations. In September 2024, a much-needed Senate Judiciary Committee hearing was held on the, quote, tide of hate crimes in America. Witnesses from the Jewish Advocacy Center and Arab American Institute testified before the committee. The mother of 66-year-old Wadia, who was stabbed to death, sat in the front row. Kenneth Stern, who authored the working definition of anti-Semitism, provided testimony. The executive director of the Arab American Institute was questioned by Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, and he asked her more than once, despite her response, "You support Hamas, don't you?" He ended his questioning by saying, "You should hide your head in the bag." This was at a hate crimes hearing by government officials. So now I ask you, how are you going to meet the moment? There's individual and institutional approaches. Let's start with the individual. Show of hands, how many here have been on the receiving end of a microaggression, racist comment, or behavior? That's like almost everyone. Okay, hands down. And then now, who here has witnessed someone who was on the receiving end of a microaggression and was stunned and remained awkwardly silent? Also, most of us, if not all of us. So number one is going to be awareness of our implicit biases. We all carry them, all of us. It doesn't make us bad, it doesn't make us good. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, homophobia, anti-Palestinian racism. Awareness is not sufficient, but it's the building block so you can start to do the anti-racist work. Number two, recognize our relative privileges. This references leveraging the relative privilege we have in the moment to be an upstander for the individual with less privilege. We all carry different privileges in varying contexts. We have the privilege of being in this convention hall, sheltered, without threat of an airstrike. Many of your schools are covering your fees to fill your souls in connection and learning. Number 3, demonstrate personal allyship. Don't be a bystander. We all agree that bigotry is unacceptable, but when we see it, we're silent because it makes us uncomfortable. We need to prime ourselves, train our students, and actually practice how to respond in the moment. It matters less what you say and more that you introduce a filler. It buys you the moments to think about what to say or do next, while simultaneously halting the train in its tracks instead of letting that moment pass into the abyss of awkwardness and it's now too late. One phrase I've found works in most situations is, hey, that's not okay. And intonation is everything, because it can be, hey, that's not okay. Or like, hey, that's not okay. So humor me, we are going to practice together with some real life examples, okay? With each example, if it aligns with your values, we're going to say, hey, that's not okay. You guys cool with this? Okay, all right, so example number 1. I'm rounding on patients in the hospital with my medical team, and my patient points at me and says, your people are killing people in Los Angeles. If you were in the room, you all would say,
hey, that's not okay.
Awesome. I'm doing this, it's intentional, I promise. It's like the neurologic priming and establishing new neural pathways. I can geek out. Okay. Yes. Number 2, my female attending with short hair and cargo pants. She has a new patient who tells her, you look like a man. Women don't look like that in my country. No, really, you look like a man.
Hey, that's not okay.
Third example. On a rotation, and a white colleague comments on a black colleague's hair, saying, wow, your hair is so cool, can I touch it? And proceeds to stroke it without permission.
Hey, that's not okay.
Imagine if we all stood up for one another, we would never feel alone. Now, for educators. Recommendations for educators on inclusion of students of all religious, secular, and spiritual identities go into 3 categories. And this framing, by the way, was provided to me by the Department of Education's Director of Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. I'm not just pulling it out of, Okay, number 1, religious literacy. It is about awareness raising. For example, what are the religions of the world, and what is the lived experience for students from these diverse backgrounds, including discrimination they may face? It includes addressing bias and inaccuracies in the curricula. Number 2, rights and recommendations. For example, are school policies and practices inclusive of religious attire? Are accommodations made for prayer or for fasting during Ramadan? Does the school accommodate absences for holidays and avoid scheduling exams or mandatory events on significant holidays? Are there halal food options available? Another takeaway would be actually doing trainings on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian racism. Number 3 is school climate. How is the school taking steps to prevent and also address bullying? Are they working both with students who are targeted because of their religion or other identities, and with the students who are engaging in bullying behavior? Let's talk about school climate for a second. There should be an emphasis on inclusion and belonging. Drop tolerance. I don't want anyone tolerating me. Number 2, teacher and staff training in bullying prevention and implementation of schools' anti-bullying program. I'll take that a step further and say, do you have an anti-bullying program? Number 3, cultural sensitivity. I'm getting to scroll down a little bit. And support for minority students. Do you have affinity groups for the true minorities of your schools? And unless you're in a faith-based school where faith is part of your mission, then predominantly Judeo-Christian songs have no place in your music curriculum. Either equally represent all faiths, make your music curriculum secular, or stick to your twinkle twinkles. For administrators, everything previously also applies, but a reminder that anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and anti-Semitic discrimination is illegal. The Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 bars discrimination, including on the basis of religion, national origin, and race, in all aspects of employment, including hiring, firing, pay, job assignments, promotions, layoffs, training, fringe benefits, and any other term or condition of employment. To this organization, on your website you say, participants leave the conference better equipped to improve the interracial, interethnic, and intercultural climate in your school, which will have a positive impact on the academic, social, emotional, and workplace performance outcomes for students and adults alike. Then lovingly, and I underscore lovingly, I ask, when the single most divisive issue in your membership has been related to the ongoing genocide in Palestine, where is the Palestinian voice on this stage and in your workshops? Not a single workshop addressing this issue. How do you explain that? How exactly are you going to go back to your schools better equipped if we just brush it under the rug and continue to silence those hurting? I'm reminded by MLK's quote, "A time comes when silence is betrayal." Do not let your discomfort in truly meeting the moment, that's what this is about, right? To be remembered as your silence on the issue. Because remember, silence is complicity in violence, oppression, and racism. And yes, I just quoted myself, so you folks in the media have a soundbite. Okay. None of this is easy to talk about, or bring up, or rehash. But I do this for my brother and sisters-in-law. I do this for the 25 family members I've lost in the last decade to various forms of hate-fueled violence. I also do this for my children, Adam and Emily. They are the legacies I leave behind. They are descendants of a professor who left partitioned India and Pakistan. They are descendants of a prominent legal scholar and judge in the Ottoman Empire, whose roots go back to Rome during the Crusades. They are descendants of a child refugee from Holocaust Austria. They are descendants of Syrians who have since become refugees in the largest refugee crisis the world has seen, whose great-grandparents' home just came down in an airstrike 3 days ago, whose uncle and aunt were murdered in this country in an Islamophobic hate crime, whose cousins they will never meet, They are citizens of this world we all share. These are the children who will be going to one of your schools next year, whom you teach, frame their thinking, teach them their history and how to think critically. What a responsibility and privilege. Who will you allow to write that history and teach it? Will it be shaped around values of inclusion and justice, or will it be silencing and oppression? How will you meet the moment to nurture their souls, identities, and shape their futures, thereby shaping the future of our world? I will leave you with this video montage of family members that have departed too soon in the last decade to honor their memory and show them they are not forgotten.
Dr. Suzanne Barakat for that amazing speech. I am here to wish you all a good evening. Be safe, enjoy your night.